I preface it by saying that they were sincere anti-slavery advocates. The issue for the slavery sisters, the Grimke sisters, was the issue for many slaveholding members of a slaveholding society, which was that they really didn't know what to do with Black people once Black people were not enslaved, right? How did you react to a Black person who was a person? And of course, they realized Black people were people in their household. And the whole first part of the book is talking about their interactions with enslaved people. But they didn't, under that system, they didn't countenance that Black people were up here equal. They were sort of down here in that famous image of, am I not a man and a brother or a sister and that icon that anti-slavery activists used.
Hello and welcome to Rap Hall at the Boston Public Library. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Kristen Motti from the Boston Public Library team, and we'll meet some other people in just a moment. Thank you to all of you for being here, both in person and also online. We have a very large online audience with us this evening. Our partners, thank you to you. We are partnering with American Ancestors, the GBH Forum Network, Postman Books, Porter Square Books, and also a big thank you to Dr. Kerri Greenidge and Dr. Kelly Carter Jackson for being here and sharing the Grimkes with us.
Thank you, Kristen, and welcome to all of you to this really illuminating evening. I've been reading this book and I'm 60 pages from the end, and I can't believe I have to got pulled away from it. I'm Margaret Talcott. I'm producer of the American Inspiration Author Series, sponsored by American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. As Kristen said, we are a nonprofit library around the corner from here. We're a research center for people researching family history. It is such a great honor to be introducing these two truly inspiring American historians. Our featured author tonight, Kerri K. Greenidge, is a Mellon Assistant Professor in the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University. Dr. Greenidge is the author of Black Radical, The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter. Among many prizes, Black Radical received the Mark Linton Prize in History, the Massachusetts Book Award, and the J. Anthony Lucas Award. As well as one of our favorites, Peter J. Gomes Book Prize from the Massachusetts Historical Society. Dr. Greenidge's writings has appeared in such publications as The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The Guardian. Closer to home, she's presented here at the BPL. Perhaps some of you have seen her here. And as part of its local history series, which this book is full of all sorts of Boston, particularly Hyde Park history and Cambridge history. And she serves as historian in residence for the Museum of African American History. Our esteemed moderator, Kelly Carter Jackson, is an historian, author, and educator. She is the Michael and Denise Kellen 68 Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. And she also serves as a historian in residence for the Museum of African American History here in Boston, up on Beacon Hill. Dr. Carter Jackson is the author of the book Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, which won numerous awards, including the Scheer James H. Broussard Best First Book Prize. She and Dr. Greenidge have had their work shortlisted also for the Museum of African American History Stone Book Prize. Dr. Carter Jackson is currently at work on a new book called Losing LaRoche, the story of the only Black passenger on the Titanic. So now on to the heart of our program. Welcome, Dr. Greenidge, and welcome, Dr. Carter Jackson. We're so thrilled you're here. Come right up.
First, I just want to say thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really consider this an honor, a pleasure, a privilege. Kerri is such a great friend. She's a dynamic historian. I feel like I model a lot of myself after you. And this book is just amazing. I was telling my students, she taught in my class last week, and it was so great to have, I always love when I can put people on the syllabus that I know that can come into my classes and talk. And I told my students, this book is really chewy. You know, it covers a lot of things. You talk about race, you talk about gender, you talk about trauma and shame and secrecy and family histories. There's so much there. There's a wonderful like cast of characters at the beginning of the book that it almost makes it feel like a novel. How did you get your hands around this rich family history of probably one of the most well-known, if not famous, families of the 19th century?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. This is an absolute pleasure, and I'm thankful to the Boston Globe and New York Times Book Review. You kind of sit alone in your room in your house writing and doing your work, and you just put it out in the world and want to see what happens. So thank you very much. But I would say when I started the research, I kept on coming across the name Grimke when I was researching my first book on William Monroe Trotter. And they were everywhere. So from the time when I started with Trotter in the 19th century, you heard about the Trotter, the Grimke sisters. By the time Trotter reaches a certain age, you hear about Archibald Grimke, you hear about the playwright. And so their name kept coming up in that research. And one of the things I was very concerned with was reckoning with the myth surrounding the Grimkes versus the reality surrounding them. And what did it mean to be this very public, multiracial family from roughly 1860s through the 1930s, at a time when the country's perceptions of that multicultural Black and white mixture was changing so drastically. And then what types of burdens did that put upon the survivors of the family, particularly the Black survivors? And then what did it mean to reckon with the truth versus the reality of the Grimke sisters? And so as I was researching the Trotter book, I kept on coming across little splices about their life, the commentary from the press about them being this distinguished family of color on one hand, and then reading their personal papers in which there were all these secrets that kind of popped up. And this was going back to like the 1840s all the way up to the 1930s.
So, okay, I want to ask you a question that's like 3 parts.
Yes.
But it's a question that I ask all of my students whenever we're discussing a book. I will ask them, tell me something new, tell me something renewed, and tell me something challenging. New meaning something that you learned, renewed meaning something that you always knew and you were reminded of it in a way that was unique or special. And then challenging, and I imagine there's a lot that's challenging about the Grimkes, but something that you thought was particularly challenging, either in the research or understanding their lives.
So I think renew, these are good questions, Kelly. That'd be so renew, I think, would probably be, and these are images of the 2 women I start the book with, Angelina Grimke on the right, and then Angelina Hamilton on the left. And I think one of the things that was renewed was this idea that the Grimke family legacy persisted well into the 20th century. And these were people who were alive, 1920s, 1930s, who were still reckoning with the enslavement that their parents and grandparents had lived through. So I think it was a sort of a renewal of recognizing that fact, right? That, you know, slavery is so close to people's families' history, and particularly if you were alive in the 20s and 30s, that's your lifetime, that you're actually around people who were both slaveholders and enslaved. And then I think kind of one of the challenging things was making sure that I got the voices of Nancy Weston, who was the enslaved mother, as much as possible, given that she did not write. She was never taught how to read or write when she was enslaved to the Grimke families, which was another peculiar kind of secret, which we can get into. And so trying my best to decipher where she came from, given the narrative that historians have told ourselves about Nancy Weston. And part of that narrative of Nancy Weston came from the narrative that we have about the white Grimke sisters who are pictured here. And I really wanted to make sure the challenge of making sure that Nancy Weston's voice and life was accounted for as best as the historical record would provide. Prior to my research, every kind of book or article or material from the early 20th century that you had on the Grimke brothers was that Nancy Weston was enslaved. Somehow the man she was enslaved to, Henry Grimke, was a kindly master. Those are the words that were used both in Gander Lerner's book and in the Grimke sisters' accounts. And yet there were all these clues that that might not be the case. For instance, why out of all, why did she never learn how to read or write, given that this family had put such a premium on literacy for themselves and for their family, and the Grimke sisters themselves put such a primacy on reading for themselves. And so I really wanted the challenge was to make sure I got that story correct. And that was a lot of mulling through the archive, going all the way back to these plantation records and sale records, and I'm deciphering who she was as best as I could in terms of where she came from.
Is it what was challenging, also what was new information for you too?
What was probably the biggest new information for me was that the violence that we know about it as historians, particularly my field is not specifically on slavery in the United States or in the Atlantic world, but, you know, doing research after the Civil War, I kind of encountered the violence, and you, of course, deal with this in your work and the response to it, but just the violence of running a plantation household and how the Grimkes, because they kept such good records, how casually that was talked about in the records that you're reading, going all the way back to like the 1780s, all the way up until the end of the Civil War. You know, the records, the letters between each other about, you know, selling children and nobody really having a qualm about that. And so that was something that as somebody who my field isn't necessarily slavery, is kind of the aftermath of it. It was really, it was a new way of looking at this family, of how blatant and common the violence was in that household, given just the records that they kept amongst themselves.
You know, it's interesting because you talk about how people referred to the Grimkes as like benevolent masters, that they were, you know, kind people just caught up in a bad system. You know, it's so unfortunate that this happened. And I was reading also about this one Irish playwright who was talking about how it's even more problematic to talk about good slave masters than bad ones, because when you talk about good masters, you preclude on the idea that slavery was in fact necessary. You don't question the system itself. The goal is to be a good master, not to abolish the system, but just to be a good master. And I wonder, like, how much silence or secrecy or shame is associated with who the Grimkes were as slaveholders, because it's the whole reason that, you know, Angelina and Sarah leave. But there's still not a lot that's discussed within what it means to be a part of that family and benefit and be advantaged by that.
Yes. So I prefaced this in my last talk by saying that the conundrum, I think, of the white Grimke sisters and the lessons that they might have, or that I took from them, was that they were sincere anti-slavery advocates. It wasn't as if they were faking disliking slavery. It wasn't as if they were somehow insincere. They sincerely believed that slavery itself was an evil system. Sarah Grimke, who was the first sister to leave Charleston and went to Philadelphia, was from a very, very early age horrified by seeing the slavery as it was enacted both in her household, in the plantations, and in Charleston. And so I preface it by saying that they were sincere anti-slavery advocates. The issue for the slavery sisters, the Grimke sisters, was the issue for many slaveholding members of a slaveholding society, which was that they really didn't know what to do with Black people once Black people were not enslaved, right? How did you react to a Black person who was a person? And of course, they realized Black people were people in their household. And the whole first part of the book is talking about their interactions with enslaved people. But they didn't, under that system, they didn't countenance that Black people were up here are equal. They were sort of down here in that famous image of, am I not a man and a brother or a sister and that icon that anti-slavery activists used. And so that made it very problematic when they left Charleston and went to Philadelphia, and they arrived in Philadelphia in the early 1820s, and they embraced anti-slavery, and they're in Philadelphia, and they want to become good Quaker women. And yet the letters that and their interactions they're having with the free Black community there that had been abolitionists since, at least the 1760s, right? Very, very well established Black community with institutions of their own who had rejected, very famously, the Colonization Society. The Grimke sisters didn't know how to react to that Black community and actually reacted to them in a way of paternalism mixed with this, a mixture of misunderstanding. And that the Black women themselves were the ones who called the white women on this, right? So when they first arrived in Philadelphia, they meet the Fortin women and they meet the Bustill women who had been, they're second generation Black abolitionist women who know how the city works. They know how organized abolition works. They know the uses of violence, as you talk about in your work. They know these things. And the Grimke sisters come in and are like, we're introducing anti-slavery to you. And the Black women are the ones who are saying, no, this is part of our community. So I think that was their biggest, one of their biggest flaws, particularly when they're interacting. I also think that they had a hard time reckoning with the fact that they left the slave system, but their family continued to profit off of slavery and the slave trade in particular. And that didn't interfere with the relationships that they had with their family members in a way that made them blind to the fact that cruel and very violent system continued, even though they left. And so the Grimke sisters were still writing and talking to their family once the Grimke sisters went to Philadelphia. They're still consulting their mother, who's talking about selling Black people because they've gotten too unruly or they've gotten out of control, and what should she do? And they're giving her advice. They're still, they're still within that world. Despite the fact that they're in Philadelphia. And so one of the things is the misconception that the Grimke sisters somehow they left the South and they never interacted again with their family really is not, true at all.
They didn't sort of sever all ties.
Didn't sever all ties at all, right? And in fact, one of the more heartbreaking stories in the book that I talk about is an enslaved man named Stephen, who was brought up from the time he was a very little boy to be the butler in the Grimke household. And he was considered the playmate of the Grimke sisters' brother, Henry. Henry became the man who had children with Nancy Weston, who becomes the mother of the Black Grimkes. And so Henry, as a little boy, was seen as extremely violent, even as a child, would torture this poor enslaved young man named Stephen, banging his head against doors and beating him up and liking to see that he would pass out, and all these horrendous sort of descriptions of abuse that kind of the Grimke family just talked about, again, in their letters to one another that was pretty casual. And by the 1840s, when the Grimke sisters had retired and Angelina Grimke Weld is now married and has children of her own, their mother contacts the Grimke sisters asking them, well, what should she do with Stephen? He's suffered so much brain damage, he can't work. And he's not worth any money. And so how should they deal with him? And they have all these letters that go back and forth for about, a year about what to do with this young man, and this man who's now a grown man, and the advice that they have. And previous historians had seen that, this is a benevolent Grimke sisters. Isn't it kind that they basically take Stephen and they free him in New Jersey? And really what I wanted to concentrate on is, but what does that actually mean in the scheme of slavery and enslavement and the history of Black-white relationships in the United States and in this a slave society, right? When he gets to New Jersey, the Grimkes talk about how disappointed they are that he can't find a job. Right. And shouldn't he work? Right. And he's become a burden on their household because he's working for them and he can't really farm. Right. And so to me, that was very telling about the ways that the Grimke sisters interacted with and thought about Black people, as human beings, not as a cause. Right. Not as something that you're saying this is a sin. Not as something that you're saying this is a sin and it reflects on me. But actual human beings. Right. That was what they kind of missed.
I feel like the title of this book could have been called Cognitive Dissonance. Because there's so much of that in the book where you're like, how are you not aware? How are you not thinking about, I mean, even in the opening chapter, when there's a massive riot that takes place in the Philadelphia Black community, and it's horrific. I even write about it in my own book about the violence that takes place in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love.
Yes.
It's like, you know, exploding. Black businesses and churches and schools are destroyed. And there's almost no mention of it by the Grimke sisters. Yeah. And they're living in Philadelphia at the time.
I charted the neighborhoods because that's how nerdy I was during COVID. I got the maps of the neighborhoods, and like right where the newspapers are covering it, they're about 3 blocks away in their house.
That's incredible.
And they don't, for women who kept such very intricate diaries, records of Philadelphia, talking about what's happening in the city, talking about this person lives here, this person has this person is a Quaker, this person is not. For women who kept such minute detail, they never mention any of the riots, which again, you can tell a lot from the silences people have. It's not just by what they talk about.
Yes. Right? Oh my gosh. The silences, I think, tell a whole story. One of the questions I had is, goes back to the benevolent master, and it's the idea of Nancy. And you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. I understood Nancy Weston almost as I'm going to put this carefully, like a concubine, I would say, almost like someone who has these 3 children by Grimke, and is promised that her children will be freed, but they're not freed. And what happens in that exchange? Why weren't her sons freed? They did have special treatment, Archibald and Francis and John, but they're not freed. I mean, freedom doesn't really come for them until like the Civil War. And I think that's even more telling, that the idea of being a good master, and yet no one's willing to relinquish their best property.
Yes. So Nancy Weston, one of the things I discovered about her that's in the book is that she was part of a family called the Weston family, half of whom were eventually freed by the white man who owned them, named Plowden Weston. So Plowden Weston had multiple children with an enslaved Black woman, as did his father and his brothers. When Plowden Weston died, he freed some of those children, who became the founders of a free Black community within Charleston. She was related to that family, bless you. She was related to that family. And yet she and some of her siblings were not freed. So first of all, to me, that was, and there's a great historian named Chakrabarty Myers, whose book is called Forging Freedom. Don't quote me on it. No, it's all about Black women and their relationships and the ways in which they tried to leverage this horribly, sadistically, sexually abusive system in ways that would complicate the ways that they could not be freed underneath the law or by the will of white masters. And so Nancy Weston was related to many of these enslaved Black women who were eventually freed. And so she, as her sons later told, from the time they were very little, would tell them these stories about that she was members of the colored Westons. These were her terms, not mine. I use them in the book, right, with the quotes. That they were colored Westons, and that the colored Westons were special because they were free. And through that, she ended up with the Grimke family. It's kind of unclear exactly how that happened. I kind of talk about it in the book, how that happened. But she ends up being purchased by Henry F. Grimke, and he then eventually moves her from the city where she had always been to his plantation out in the countryside. And she had a relationship with him through which she tried to do what many Black women, including many women in her family, tried to do, which was trying to, in any way that she could, resist the worst aspects of sexual violence in terms of her relationship with Henry. So she, for instance, got her own cabin. She was allowed to raise her own food so she could stave off some of the hunger that the enslaved people had. Henry F. Grimke was notorious for only barely feeding his enslaved people. So he's known as being very, very cruel in terms of parceling food. And so she was given her own cabin and her own crops to yield so that she could feed herself. And through that, she then would give food to the other enslaved people. And Archibald can remember as a very little kid watching his mother give food to the other enslaved people. So she did have a privileged
put that
position
in quotes,
put that in quotes comfortably.
Yes.
The issue with the Grimkes, though, was that they were business people, and they were very successful business people, and this was a property. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is show that the narrative that we had, that narrative that people have, which is that, well, he couldn't free his slaves, which is kind of what a lot of previous historians had. He couldn't free his slaves because there was a law in Charleston that said you couldn't free enslaved people. Not really true, because we do know that many white men who had children with enslaved Black women, some of them did free them by sending them out of the state or by signing their free papers and sending them elsewhere. So Henry F. Grimke, in other words, had a choice. And his choice was that 3 months after Archie was born in 1849, he rewrote his will so that Archie and any other children he had with this enslaved woman would be given to his white sons, right? Which is a pretty conscious decision, right? 3 months after your first son with an enslaved Black woman is born, you change your will to put this as a codicil into your will. So that was, to me, was very telling that would happen. And so then my complications and my challenge with writing about Nancy was, what did that then mean in the constellation of her life in Charleston, in which she knew that there were Black women, for instance, in her family, who had some sort of relationship with white men. And somehow their children managed to either go to Cincinnati or go to Philadelphia and have a better life. For Nancy, then, when Henry died, and the Grimke family basically moved her back to Charleston, didn't give her anything, set up a house for her, and basically told her to fend for herself. How it is that she's going to then relate to those little boys, having to raise them and teach them you are a Weston, but also realizing that she might not perhaps make it to where the rest of her family is, which is having children with white men, and those children having a different set of life than her children had.
And her children have this revelation that they are in fact enslaved. That being somewhat distant from the city, they had slightly more autonomy about their identity and who they thought they were in relationship to slavery. But when they come back to Charleston, it's a whole nother ball game for them. And, Frederick Douglass talks about this in his narrative, like the moment he realizes, oh my God, I'm a slave, I'm enslaved, I have no choice. And I can't imagine what that must have felt like for them, realizing that their world had gotten much, much smaller with the death of their father, who's also their slaveholder.
Exactly. And this is a picture of the Grimke brothers, right? When they entered Lincoln University, and in 1866. So this is less than a year after they escape enslavement. And one of the things that strikes me about this image of them as young boys is that the shock that came to them when their half brother, so Henry had children from his second wife, who is white. Their half brother Montague returned back to Charleston at the start of the Civil War, became a diehard supporter of the Confederacy, and basically wanted to turn his little brothers into slaves. And so summoned Henry to come into the house and serve him. And it was this battle between Montague, Nancy, and the boys to turn them into slaves. And so there's very beautiful, brutal recollections of the way that Montague basically beat up, tortured his brothers, sent them to the notoriously horrible Charleston workhouse, trying to basically break their will. And they're 12 and 13 when this begins.
They're children.
And Archie fleeing, running away, right? And hiding. One of the famous stories is he disguised himself as a girl so that he could go from house to house and would hide underneath in people's chimneys. Frank ended up running away, and eventually Montague found Frank again and sold him to a Confederate troop. And so the boys, by the end of the Civil War, have experienced enslavement. They experienced the brutality, and they've also experienced, as you're talking about, the fact that they experienced an earlier life in which they had certain relative privileges in the countryside, and then were brought to the city and encountered this horror.
So I want to bring it a little bit forward. I know we have a couple more minutes before I want to take questions from the audience, but in that moment, this is a really good time, I think, to pivot to what happens to the brothers when they do get freedom and they get educated and they get brought to the North and have opportunities that very few Black people in all of America at this point has. You know, they are able to get this incredible education and become very prominent in their community. And I wonder how their lives or how their experiences shaped their ideas about freedom and advocacy and how an upward or mobility, racial uplift. I mean, these become, you call them race men.
Yes. So this is a picture of them with their third brother, and I'll get to their younger brother in a second. They connect with their white aunts in 1868. The two oldest brothers, Archibald and Frank, ended up making their way to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. They got there through the ingenuity of Nancy. Nancy was working as a maid in one of the schools that was founded by the Freedmen's Bureau in Charleston. Goes to one of the heads of the school, says she wants her sons to go to school there. They go to school. Her sons are immediately seen as pretty as bright and gifted, and so convinces the members of the American Missionary Association to take the boys to Massachusetts, where they eventually end up with foster families. When Nancy finds out the foster families are not educating them, she advocates that something else has to be done. And eventually the boys make their way to Lincoln, where they succeeded as students. And eventually from there, Archie went on to Harvard University Law School, graduated and became a very prominent attorney in the city of Boston, and also a newspaper editor, was very involved in local politics in Boston and in Massachusetts, and eventually ended up getting a position as the head of the board of trustees at Westboro State Hospital, which was sort of the premier mental health institution in the country at the time. And then eventually caught the attention of the Cleveland administration and became an ambassador to what becomes the Dominican Republic. And one of the things I examined with Archie's success was the ways in which he reenacted many of the lessons of enslavement in the South onto the people that he encountered in Santo Domingo, as he referred to it, the Dominican Republic in the 1890s. The ways that he referred to Dominican peasants, commenting on their skin color, the fact that they could not, quote unquote, govern themselves, was sort of this manifestation of the ways in which American enslavement produces American empire, which then if you are in the service of that empire, even as a Black African-American man, the ways in which you then become in service to that empire that then oppresses other people who are African descendant people. Archibald, I'm careful to say, did not invent, going into the Dominican Republic, as we know, but he fully takes advantage of his position to negotiate the sale of land to, this is on the book, to a very wealthy businessman who then basically sees the way for the Dominican Republic's economy to be taken over by the United States economy, and saw no qualms or problems with this, right? Unlike many other Black people who reckoned with or talked about empire in the 1890s and early 20th century, Archibald Grimke was missing from those conversations, right? So he didn't see and would defend until he died the American project in Santo Domingo, as he called it, which bore a lot, I would argue, of resemblance to the ways in which he was treated as an enslaved person in the South. In terms of Frank ended up going on to Princeton Theological Seminary, was a very, very gifted theologian, and then became minister of the 15th Street, 15th Street Presbyterian Church, one of the most exclusive Black churches in the country. It was the church of former Black congressmen, office holders, Howard University professors, all of those. So that class, that talented 10th that Du Bois spoke about, this was their church. And Frank, when he became the minister of this church, I saw in the records somebody who was determined to transform that church into what he saw as a vehicle, he said, for racial uplift. This idea that this was going to be the church that members of the Black elite went to. And you can actually see in his records that are kept from the time he became minister until, roughly until he left the ministry in the 1920s, the ways in which he talked about working class Black people in the records of that church. Talking about how this church might not be the right one for them because it was
like a country club.
Yes, right, because it was a church of I'm trying to get the quote right, of high refinery and aplomb, right? Wow. And that didn't mean that they couldn't partake of the services that the church offered, because the church did a lot of charity services and did a lot of good work in the community. But that as members, kind of the Black masses, he very consciously often did not believe that they should be members. And a lot of this had to do with skin color. And in the book, I argue, that one of the things that Frank absorbed from his time as a slave was this idea of skin color, of the fact that there were a class of Black people who were more deserving of being fortunate, that somehow he and Archie were, and this was a carryover from their mother, they were kind of different than other Black people, given their educations, which I point to in the book as being one of the, tragedies of the Grimke brothers going into the 20th century. I mean, again, this is why I said there's so much there, because there's a clear narrative of like how hurt people. There's also a miraculous story of how an enslaved person goes to becoming their own, having their own church, becoming a founding member of the NAACP, doing all of these really incredible things. And at the same time, there's this underbelly, this distasteful underbelly of colorism and elitism that is often, I think, modeled by the Grimkes themselves, which makes a lot of this complicated. So I want to keep asking questions, but I know we need to open it up to the audience. I'm sure the audience has questions as well. Even if you haven't had a chance to read the book, we know it's newly released, but if you have questions for Dr. Greenidge, we'll take them at this time. I have a couple questions here if anyone's slow to speak at first, but I want to make sure we get someone. Okay, someone right there. Yeah. Oh, there's a microphone coming right to you. Just give it 1 second.
Hi, I wanted to ask you in your research, did you see is there a pattern that you could point to, sort of pattern of what distinguished Black men who got educated, or Black women who got educated and became race men versus those who did not, and who basically held the same sort of attitudes white people had toward Black people? So is there a distinction? Are there things that distinguish those who became sort of much more race conscious and sort of those who went to sort of race uplift versus those who looked down on Black people, particularly Black people who were of a different color? So I'm just very curious about patterns. Are there patterns?
Thank you for your question. And there's been a lot of historians. I'm thinking of the work of somebody like a Jacqueline Moore, who came out with a great book called Leading the Race, which is all about the Black upper class, which is one of the books I rely upon a lot. There's a lot of research that historians have done on dynamics of class and colorism and what makes, race men and race women. Hazel Carvey, of course, doing work. All these people who have done this work before. But I would say that in terms of my research on the Trotters versus the Grimkes, I mean, hesitate to put it in those terms. But I think that many people, and many Black people in this era, 1865 to roughly 1930s, considered themselves race men. And that was a very contested term in and of itself, right? So somebody like Archibald Grimke and Frank Grimke were considered race men. They were considered and were covered prominently in the Black press as being leaders of the community, and were very well respected. Again, for the things that you were pointing out, which is helping to found the NAACP and the American Negro Academy, and running the church and the charities that the 15th Street Presbyterian Church did for the community. One of the things I was interested in, and I think that your question speaks to, is what are the limits of that if the idea of what it means to be a race man or a race woman hinges on the fact that somehow the person enacting that is better than or different from the masses that they claim to lead. So William Monroe Trotter, for instance, for all of his flaws, and I talk about them a lot in the book, for all of his flaws, had a sense that he came from and belonged to the people that he professed to lead, right? And that's very different than saying, I am somebody who is leading people to their destiny, right? And so I think the distinction often can be, just in terms of my work, and there's the 2 books that I've done, is that the Grimke brothers, like their white aunts, genuinely believed that they were leading Black people who didn't know what it was that they wanted, right? And I often, as I was doing the research and writing the book, was cautioning myself that we see that a lot today, with people claiming that people who are disenfranchised or people who are marginalized somehow need to be told what they want and what they need. And very well-meaning people tend to do that, right?
Yes.
Oh, they don't really know, this group of people don't really know what they want, what they really need is this. I know what's best for them. And I think that's kind of a disease of this type of version of uplift. I can't really speak to or say, this is what makes somebody more radical or more of the people than another person. I can say that it with many of the Grimke's contemporaries, the people who managed to escape this trap were people who constantly said, I'm not different than the people who are coming to the talk that I'm giving, right? Whereas the Grimke's didn't have that way of thinking. They generally thought of themselves as leading the masses because the masses ultimately didn't really know what they wanted, right? And so that's a very perilous way of thinking about uplift that I think people, particularly very progressive people even today, tend to have, right?
And can I add, we've talked about this before, I think fame and celebrity pollutes, corrupts people, money, all of the prestige. Do you know who I am? The Grimke name.
Yeah, the Grimke name. Yep.
It does a job
on
someone's ability to think more of themselves than they should.
Yes.
We have time for maybe a couple more questions. Yeah, a couple more questions. Sure.
From online.
Okay, sure.
From Priscilla. First off, she makes a wonderful comment. She says, thank you for this clear, engaging, and brilliant scholarship. Powerful presentation. I am eager to read this book. I regret that I am not in person. And then she follows on with an additional question that others have echoed online. Are members of the Grimke family still in Boston? And were you able to meet descendants of either Grimke family anywhere?
So good question. So I started this book right when COVID hit. I made a trip to Charleston many years ago and got to walk around the streets of Charleston, actually see some of these places. But I was very, very lucky that I got in contact with the fabulous researchers at the Clements Library at the University of Michigan, who basically scanned for me all of the papers, because of course I couldn't go anywhere. And I was, almost in tears, like, I'm never going to finish this book because I can't get access. So from being able to do that research, I did not uncover that there are descendants of Grimke's living in Boston. There were 3 Grimke brothers, Archie, Frank, and their youngest brother, John. Archie had a daughter, Angelina Grimke, the playwright, and she did not have any children. Frank Grimke had one daughter who died at 6 months old and then had no other children. John Grimke, and as I get into the book for various reasons, is often excluded from the other 2 Grimke brothers for sort of classist reasons, and get into the book. And there is evidence that he might have had children, but that those children were born out of wedlock, and that some of those children took a different last name. Now, I didn't put this in the book. It's kind of in a footnote. It's one of those things that I urge other historians and researchers to kind of take this and run with it in a way that I couldn't for this particular book. So therefore, that means that the Black Grimke family, as far as I was able to decipher, does not have any living relatives in Boston, and they probably do not have any living relatives that I have managed to find. If people discover through John Grimke that that's different, then that could be the case. In terms of the white Grimke family, there are descendants of Grimke's in and throughout the Charleston area. Angelina Grimke Weld had 3 children. Two of her children had children, one of whom became the Angelina Hamilton, who ends up becoming a very prominent woman psychiatrist in the state of Illinois. And that granddaughter did not have children. So the Grimkes that I cover in the book, as far as I've been able to distinguish, do not have living survivors. The Grimke family, because there were 11 surviving children who are the siblings of the white Grimke sisters, those siblings did have generations and generations of children who are still alive. Whether their last name is Grimke, they intermarried with the Manigault family, which is a prominent family, and the Ball family, which is a prominent family.
The same Ball family of Edward Ball?
Edward Ball, yes.
No
who wrote about,
way!
yes.
Crazy.
Yes, Slaves in the Family, Edward Ball's
Okay.
book, which is all about his ancestors. They married into a branch of the Grimke and the Smiths, who are related to the Grimkes.
Wow. That's crazy to
Yes.
me. That's crazy. Do we have time for one more question? I see one way up in the back.
Thank you. I first heard of the Grimke sisters when I was at the Concord Museum, and they have their pictures, and they said how important they were in the abolition movement. I don't know why they're not more famous, but I think they should be. But I was late, so maybe you've already answered this, but I'd like to hear about their lecture program and their influence. Did they just go around New England lecturing anti-slavery, or what was their role?
So the Grimke sisters, sort of the height of their fame was roughly 1837 to 1839. 1837, Angelina Grimke publishes basically a treatise to the Christian women of the South, in which she argues that Southern white women need to join the anti-slavery cause, and not just that they have a special role to play in anti-slavery leadership. That became a source of controversy because it was the first time that slave-holding Southern Native white women wrote about anti-slavery in the way that they were writing about it. By 1838, both sisters became involved in the local abolitionist movement, both the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia and the New England Anti-Slavery Society here in Boston. And so they spent 1838 speaking. And in one of those speeches that they gave, that led to them, Angelina actually speaking before the Massachusetts state legislature. She became the first American-born woman ever to do so. And so that became kind of their claim and their fame, which is that they became sisters who spoke before the Massachusetts state legislature about the need for anti-slavery petitions and about the need and the rights of women to speak in public. I point out in the book, however, that the Grimke sisters, by 1838, Angelina Weld Grimke marries Theodore Dwight Weld, and within a year she has her first child, and the remainder of their lives, which was considerable, it's about 40 years, they became esteemed educators. So they found 2 schools, both in rural New Jersey, that became kind of models of progressive education. And both of them, the Grimke sisters and Theodore Dwight Weld, founded various schools that became kind of these models of progressive anti-slavery women's rights education. They educated children of William Lloyd Garrison, children of members of the Child family, Lydia Mere Child, and so they became famous for that as well. And so their moment was roughly 1837 to 1839, in which they had this claim to fame as abolitionists and anti-slavery women.
I want to end with one question that was actually previously taken from the audience, which I think is great. I think it's personal, but it's also like a good political question as well, is that you write about sisters.
Yes.
And you have sisters.
I do. Yes, I do.
And your sisters are very successful writers, playwrights, and nonfiction or fiction authors, novelists. And I wonder if while you were writing about sisters and family and legacy, that you thought of your own family and your own relationship to sisters and how you might think about who writes what and what has an impact on people's ability to either, talk or write or work about certain things?
That was a great question. I mean, I think everything is like autobiographical, right? So I think in a way, right? So always I dedicated the book to my nieces, Katya, Sophia, Hunter, and Mavis, all of whom are having to navigate this moment that we're in the world, in which they are descendants of African-American, Afro-Caribbean, white and Italian, sort of all this mixed, Jewish, sort of kind of this mix, and they're kind of the next generation. And what does that mean for them in this moment? So I think that was very much in my mind as I was working on the book, and my relationship to my sisters, and particularly relationship to the legacy, like what legacy, I'm getting older, so it's like what legacy happens as you move on with your life, as your life goes forward, and what ghosts of your past are like that you don't even realize are haunting the next generation, right? The Grimke sisters, like most parents, believed that they were raising their own children in New Jersey in this atmosphere that was amongst, anti-slavery and reform circles. And yet they had a weird relationship to reform that then reflected and impacted their children. And so in what ways, I think I was thinking about myself and my own family, my own sisters, what legacies are we leaving, good or bad, and bad, which is everyone does both, right? You're leaving as you navigate your world as siblings and then as parents.
I think about that so much with Angelina. We didn't get a chance to talk about Angelina Grimke,
yes,
but her legacy and the questions that she is asking her father and her uncle.
Yes.
There's a picture of her here. The play that she writes, which is one of the first anti-lynching plays.
Yeah.
I think we all think about legacy. We all think about family. We all want to learn from shame. We all want to stop the stigmas that keep us from either disclosing or telling people how we can prevent more harm. This book is so human and so instructive about the way that we think of ourselves today. I said in the back of the book, this is the quintessential American story, right? Like in black and white, no pun intended. But I think that there is a lot of lessons to learn about how we look at the past and how we use looking at the past to move forward.
Yeah.
So I know Kerri is going to do a short reading for us.
So much. That was really, really fascinating. We really appreciate the time and energy. And as we have for all of our American Inspiration authors, we have asked Dr. Greenidge to do a reading from the book. And thank you so much. Back to you for that.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I'm not going to read much because I know we're running out of time, but I just want to read kind of from the beginning. I have to put on my glasses because reading all of that, those little scripts, like my eyes are ruined permanently. So I say, in our own time, during the first decades of the 21st century, America's Black elite exists in a world remarkably like the early 20th century progressive era in which the Black Grimkes lived. Like the revolutionary promise of Civil War and Reconstruction, the potential for racial and economic justice wrought by the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s has been overtaken by continued anti-Black racial violence, political disenfranchisement, and socioeconomic inequality that undergirds so much of late-stage American capitalism. The Grimkes, this book then, is thus a family biography that resonates in the lives of those who struggle with the personal and political consequences of raising children and families in the aftermath of 21st century betrayal of the radical human rights promise of the 1960s. Much like Archibald Grimke, Frances J. Grimke, and Charlotte Fortin Grimke, Frances's wife and a formidable activist in her own right, who lived through and helped shape radical abolition, slavery's violent collapse, and the egalitarian promises of radical Reconstruction. Just like that, Americans who lived through the racial and social upheavals of the modern civil rights, women's rights, and anti-war movements of the 1960s have raised children and grandchildren in a world that forgets the lessons of the recent past in favor of neoliberalism, neo-fascism, and the growth of racial inequality. For 21st century African Americans in particular, who live at a time when middle-class incomes, educational attainment, and material acquisition are no guarantee of future economic and personal stability. The Grimke family story dissects the historical roots and traumatic effects of a talented 10th anxious about its future sustainability. If collective racial trauma beleaguers the Black elite today as it did the colored elite during the Grimkes time, then what does Black success look like in the face of continued racial inequity alongside psychic and community despair? So thank you.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. I mean,
Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly.
fantastic.
Thank
This
you
is what
so
I'm talking
much.
about, though. Like, this book is so relevant. It is so timely. It is so instructive. If you have not gotten this book, I encourage you to go out, buy a copy for yourself, buy a copy for your friend, get the ebook, however you prefer to read. Support local businesses and independent bookstores. Thank you so much,
Oh,
Dr.
thank you so
Greenidge.
much for having me, Kelly. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
guys.
Thank you.